Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Saruf. We are at the ISI 2023 Honors Conference in Annapolis, Maryland, and I'm joined by one of our faculty, Dr. Jay Richards, who is the director of the Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Life, Religion, and Family, and the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He's also a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, adjunct professor at the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America, and is the author or editor of more than a dozen books, including the New York Times bestsellers Infiltrated and Indivisible, as well as Money, Greed, and God, which was winner of a 2010 Templeton Enterprise Award as well, and he's also written The Human Advantage. And he's joining me today to talk about the transgender craze that's taken over the United States in the last few years. So Dr. Richards, it's great to have you.
It's great to be with you.
And before we begin our interview, I'd like to thank our listeners for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission is educating for liberty. If you'd like to help join us in fulfilling that mission, be sure to rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. So, Dr. Richards, you are now running the show at Heritage in terms of...
At least on the gender stuff.
In terms of fighting the transgender ideology, gender ideology in general. But I know you from ISI Events. You're one of the first professors that I sort of interacted with or you're sort of an emblematic character for me as like the ISI professor.
Right.
But I know you as an econ guy.
No, that's right. I was doing this for a long time. And so I'm a philosopher. And so philosophy allows you to be a parasite on other disciplines, I guess, but for a long time, I just felt like the kind of economic questions were really pressing. And I think the same thing about the fight over gender ideology. And so I really just decided, okay, there need to be more people in that fight, and decided I was going to spend some time on it.
Yeah, so it's just like a general philosophy background.
Yeah, general philosophy, theology, political science, and so very much a kind of generalist, but I've always been interested in the kind of intersection of anthropology and metaphysics on other disciplines, whether it's natural science or the social sciences, and gender ideology in some ways. All of that kind of comes together. It's like transhumanism and artificial intelligence, right? You've got a particular philosophical view, you've got economics, you've got anthropology, all coming together. And gender ideology, in some ways, it's the most toxic poison fruit of all the worst ideas of the 19th and 20th centuries, just sort of distilled into a single issue.
Well, that's all stuff I want to get into with you. Yeah. But before I do, just on the sort of point of generalist versus specialist, there's a lot of specific information, a lot of specific insider knowledge that goes into a topic like transgenderism or gender ideology and the ways it's pervaded our entire society in the last few years. I would love, if you have a lot of students, what advice could you give them for delving into a topic, whether it's gender ideology or econ, in terms of really becoming an expert and knowing your stuff cold, and even like transitioning or sort of code switching between different...
there is code switching. I do think that a general kind of philosophy training helps because it's sort of like math, right? And so if you know a lot of math, you learn how to think systematically and frame problems, break things down. Really good philosophy, especially analytic philosophy that focuses on precision and arguments and language. That's like a Swiss Army knife intellectually, and so it kind of gives you the tools to do that. But then you have to fill it with actual content, and there really isn't any substitute for diving into the literature. And so just like with any subject, if you're saying, okay, I want to try to make sure I understand this issue, reading widely enough so that you eventually realize, okay, what are the main reference points? So like, what are the main books in the bibliography of every book that's on this, right? You read enough, you figure out what those are. But I mean, honestly, the nice thing about a particular type of philosophical training is that you spend time trying to figure out, okay, what is the essence of this particular debate? What are the specific claims? That's actually a really useful exercise, and those are a set of tools that I think you can apply them absolutely everywhere. Not everybody does that. Usually, there are different kind of incentives. If you're in a normal college or university setting, there's usually an incentive not to be a generalist, to just dig deeply, keep publishing in the peer-reviewed literature on your one thing, right? Like there was a time when I had written on this thing called the Doctrine of Divine Simplicity, and I thought, I could be a world's expert, me and 5 other people, right, on this very obscure, kind of very narrow topic. But I also realized I didn't really want to do that. I didn't feel called to do that. And so, and that's what think tanks, honestly, are really designed for. So that kind of generalist work, and especially applying ideas to public policy and to kind of practical application. And different academics, some meant to go really, really narrowly and really, really deeply, and others I think are sort of just designed dispositionally to be a generalist. I'm very much in the latter category.
Okay, I think that's a great explanation. Hopefully that helps our students in some way for how they're navigating career and things
absolutely.
like that.
Yeah.
And I know, historically speaking, most university professors would have been generalists. They would have been teaching all sorts of things because the liberal arts were considered one sort of coherent whole.
Well, and that's what's sort of funny about, in some ways, it's a really kind of, I hate to say it, it's kind of the hyper-specialization is in part a function of the fact that we just know a lot more now, about a lot of different things, but we know a lot about less in some ways. Whereas if you think about the intellectuals, even in the natural sciences that were truly influential. I mean, so like Charles Darwin, right? Darwin couldn't get tenure probably now in a biology department, or maybe Newton could, I don't know. But that's a sort of funny thing is that many of the kind of pioneers of different fields actually didn't do the kinds of things that then the people that follow them in those fields are actually incentivized to do. But that's just the kind of the nature of the modern university.
Right, great. Well, let's really dive in then. And I think a great place to start would be having you describe the state of the ground in terms of what we're up against. I'm really thinking there's a lot of contested information. Mm-hmm. It's not always clear what the claims are. Yeah. And I think we can delve into that, but sort of brass tacks or in a bird's eye view.
Yeah.
What's some of the misinformation or especially around issues of sex change surgeries on minors? Is that happening? Is it not happening? Mm-hmm. Is it good that it's happening?
Yeah. Right. The descriptive and the normative.
Yeah.
Right.
And then, social contagion theory.
Yes.
Whether or not that's real, whether, the role of underlying mental illness as sort of a comorbidity with transgender.
All of that.
Yeah.
I mean, so the sort of first question, so absolutely there are drugs and surgery happening with kids. I mean, it's sort of strange at this late date that there are people on the other side claiming that, we don't do this stuff. I had the host for Nightline actually just a few weeks ago insisted that, kids aren't being sterilized. I said, well, what do you think happens when you put a girl on puberty blockers, right, which is basically puts them into premature menopause, and then you put her on testosterone, heavy doses of testosterone, and then you move on to actual surgery. I mean, this idea that this doesn't involve, at least at the end, sterilization, I mean, it boggles the imagination, but you've had some state hearings in which there could be a detransitioner like Chloe Cole in the room, right, who had gotten top surgery, double mastectomy, and years of testosterone, and then people on the other side claiming, we don't do that, and so that's what's sort of strange about it. And I think the reason they say that is because they know intuitively that most people, if you realize, what gender ideology has inspired is this thing called gender-affirming care, which is a euphemism for affirming a distorted internal sense of gender called a gender identity. And so to affirm that, if a child feels discordant with his or her body, the way you affirm it, the way you fix the problem is not by helping them adjust their view of themselves to their body, but transforming their body to conform to this internal sense of gender. That's what gender-affirming care is. It's absolutely happening. In fact, according to the American Medical Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics and WPATH, this big international activist organization, the proper standard of treatment for gender dysphoria is the so-called affirmation model. It's absolutely what we're doing. The US is bonkers for this. We've got something like 79 pediatric gender clinics in the country, and that doesn't count the probably close to 600 Planned Parenthood clinics that are giving cross-sex hormones, like Pez dispensers, usually often on the kind of the first appointment. And so this stuff it's not being well vetted. I mean, the point of the affirmation-only approach is that the way you decide a child's gender identity is you just ask them, right? So if somebody says, well, I'm a girl trapped in a boy's body, that's the evidence, right? It's not like we have a brain scan to confirm that. So the affirmation-only approach says, then that's dispositive. And so treatment should proceed accordingly. And gender-affirming care is basically start with social transition, where you conform names and stereotypes, bathrooms, right, to the child's gender identity. And then cross-sex hormone or puberty blockers if they're young enough, and then cross-sex hormones, and then you move on to surgery, usually later in puberty, but it can be as early as 13 for girls for so-called top surgery, which would be breasts. And then usually it's true that bottom surgery, that is a genitalia, usually doesn't happen until you're about 18. But at that point, if a child's been on cross-sex hormones for several years, They're way down the path already.
Right.
We also know that prior to this craze, and which is happening everywhere, this is a very rare condition, mostly among prepubescent boys, that usually resolved itself after the boy went through puberty. Now it's largely girls that are doing this, and we know that social transition itself tends to lock kids in. So the intervention actually starts to create the problem. So if you social transition, the child's very likely to do cross-sex hormones later. So the intervention actually ends up locking kids in to a path that would have otherwise likely resolved if we hadn't done that.
Right, and that makes total sense. But I have seen, and this is a great question, that so much of this there's like emerging research and research studies. So there's studies out there that are saying actually the claims of, Abigail Shrier on social contagion, or certain detransitioners like Waltair, for instance, their claims and figures and ideas are not borne out by empirical research. So I'm wondering how, you can, I guess, separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of what's actually really hard-hitting research versus what's sort of pseudoscience or a non-replicable study that doesn't really tell you as much as it says it does. And then on the other hand, like what some of the, for instance, like I think the transgender suicide rate is like very, very high.
Yes.
And how some of these, the affirmation model might change that or might not change that. Well, there's a lot of contestation. And that's the Chloe Cole clip that's going viral in recent days.
From the congressional hearing.
It's the, would you rather have
a live son or a dead daughter?
Yeah.
That's the universal claim, because people say, how could parents ever agree to doing this to their children? Well, if you think about it from the perspective of a parent, the worst outcome that you can imagine would be your child committing suicide.
Right.
And so if you're told this is the only way to prevent them from being suicidal,
do anything.
Right, then you basically do anything. And so you would accountants things you would never otherwise tolerate. That's the kind of emotional blackmail that parents are presented with. And unless they're able to sort of go read the literature, you're just going to trust your pediatrician or whoever. The problem is it doesn't take a whole lot of investigating if you know how to read this stuff to realize that the evidence for this is just utterly lacking. I mean, the one really good study we have on suicidality and the transgender thing is a Swedish study, and it was with adults, which showed that after a decade or so, the adults that had gone through these transition procedures still had a massively increased rate of suicide. And so it didn't solve it for them. And then you get these studies that are convenient samples, a lot of kind of cherry picking of data by people like Jack Turban, it's the kind of studies that don't actually sort of confirm anything one way or the other. But of course, it sort of intuitively, you got to know, if we've been doing this for 5 or 10 years, there's a massive increase in kids that are presenting with these symptoms, and there's a brand new, look, this is a brand new innovation. Everybody knows, nobody can claim that we've been doing this for 30 years. So there's no way we can have 30-year longitudinal studies. We haven't been doing it that long. So if you just know how long we've been doing it, you got to know, look, this is just kind of by definition experimental. We can't have had the kind of studies that you would expect to have. The other thing to realize is that if you want to know, okay, what's the kind of state of the science, you do a systematic review of the evidence, which is not, that's where you don't just look at an individual study. What you do is you look at the literature as a whole, and then you rate the quality of the study based upon basically the way it's verified and the way it's set up. Every entity that has done a systematic review of the evidence has concluded that there's no evidence that the benefits outweigh the cost for these procedures. And so the health authorities in the UK with the CAS report in Finland and Sweden did systematic reviews of the evidence. They all have reversed course on the kind of full steam ahead affirmation approach. Same thing happened in the state of Florida before they decided to restrict Medicaid dollars, not pay for this. All these activist organizations which are claiming to speak for science, if they really cared, they would do systematic reviews of the evidence and they would disclose it. They don't do that. Instead, they issue these guidelines, claim they're based on science, and then they sort of create this kind of opaque situation where you don't actually know how they concluded that. But I can understand why, if you're just an innocent bystander, you don't have any choice but to trust, if I'm worried about cancer, what does the American Cancer Society say, right? You're going to assume that, well, that's kind of the best evidence, and how am I going to sort of challenge it? It really helps to know a little bit about the history of science and the way that scientific organizations work. If you know that, you know that actually these are mostly lobbying organizations. They aren't really even set up to do kind of careful analysis of the evidence. And so it's just like Americans for some reason think that the USDA is set up to tell us how to eat, right? I mean, they're not. The American Academy of Pediatrics is a lobbying organization. They didn't take a careful poll of all 60-some-odd thousand members to find out what the clinicians thought. It's a committee that came together to issue guidelines. It's obviously ideologically captured. This has happened many times before. It happened a century ago with scientific organizations in the United States with eugenics. Right. And I think that's the kind of closest sort of closest analogy historically to what we're dealing with now. It would be study what happened in the eugenics controversy, in which all the official smart organizations made claims that were false, made claims that their stuff was sort of based solidly on science. We now look back and say, oh no, that was obviously ideological capture. So then the question is, okay, since we know it's possible that medical organizations be captured by ideology and not following science, how would you tell if that was happening in the present? Right. It's easy to tell in the distance, but you need a way intellectually to say, okay, I'm not going to fall for that now. I need some kind of process of discernment by which I could say, oh no, that looks like ideological capture to me. And I would suggest that if you have an organization that sets up a committee, issues guidelines, but won't tell you the systematic way in which they came to that conclusion, that you're likely dealing with ideological capture rather than careful science.
Right. Yeah, something other than
something else. Yeah,
something other than the empirical data.
Exactly. And then when you have other countries that are doing the opposite, right, doing systematic reviews of the evidence and changing their minds, the irony here is that all these people claiming to speak for science in the U.S. are increasingly out of keeping with other countries who are actually doing that. That's something nobody wants to talk about. It's like, okay, yeah, there's some medical organizations claiming this is the right thing to do, but are you telling me that Finland and Sweden and the UK, is that a right-wing cabal that's come together? You know,
I doubt it.
Yeah, that seems unlikely.
I doubt it. Yeah. Then you said earlier you used the words metaphysics and anthropology. Yeah. What is the underlying metaphysic and anthropology that justifies or explains how this could be possible?
Yeah, you boil it down to this. Gender ideology claims that a person can be born in the wrong body. And so that really, if you're going to say, if you boil this down to a single question, is it possible for a person to be born in the wrong body or not? Right? That's just a weird claim. What does it even mean to say someone could be born in the wrong body? That would mean, it's something like there are these gendered souls floating around. I don't know, God had like a warehouse with the souls and the warehouse with the bodies, and got confused, got distracted, and mixed them up. I mean, it's a very, very bizarre claim, especially coming from people that are usually officially materialists, so they don't believe in a thing like a soul anyway. But that's actually the claim. I mean, so if you look at the gender unicorn diagram, which is a catechetical aid for kids, it talks about people not as boys and girls, but as having a gender identity, which is an internal sense of gender, gender expression, sexual orientations, and something called sex assigned at birth. You don't have biological sex. And so what gender ideology is at bottom, as it's kind of calcified in the curriculum that we're teaching kids, is that it replaces sex as a biological category that's descriptive of human beings with two other concepts. Gender identity, which is an entirely internal subjective sense of gender, and sex assigned at birth, which is a social construct. So this is radically removed from any kind of careful empirical science. It's a weird kind of postmodern Gnosticism appearing during late stage materialism, which is actually really, really strange. But that's the claim. And if you realize that people, according to this ideology, what you really are is this internal sense of gender, then all of a sudden it makes sense that the way to fix gender discordance would be not to adjust the sense of gender, because that's what you really are. It would be to change the body. So that's why gender ideologues won't say that people could change sex or that people are changing gender. What they'd say is that your real gender identity is just different from your sex assigned at birth. And so you fix the latter, not the former. And so that way, what gender affirming care is gender identity affirming care. Now, I happen to think that this very idea of a gender identity is incoherent. I actually don't think it's a real thing. I don't think it even makes sense to say you have an internal sense of gender that's somehow independent of the body. So it's like if I'm a man, I don't know what it feels like to be a woman. I can imagine what it would be like, right? And it's usually going to be based on external stereotypes, but I can't have qualia, I can't have the subjective experience of being a woman because I'm not a woman. This isn't that complicated, right? And so it's like this idea that I could have a gender identity that's distinct from that. It doesn't make any sense. I might have an illusory belief or something like that, but I actually don't even think it makes any sense. And this is why very often people that are defending this stuff, they'll say things that sound contradictory because I think they don't even really want this to be a coherent philosophy. I think what this is one of several types of critical theory which are best understood as sort of cultural wrecking balls.
Yeah.
These are just designed to destabilize categories of reality, confuse everyone so that we can destroy the present order and replace it with some kind of utopian vision. And so that's why it doesn't even have the kind of robustness that something like traditional Marxism had, where you could really kind of analyze it. This is this weird kind of cartoonish thing that I think is so unstable, it'll probably be something different 5 years from now.
Sure. And underlying this seems that relativism is lurking in the background.
Oh, yeah.
There is no objective ground of truth. There is no objective ground of order.
Yeah.
But what is interesting is they also do have the idea of sex assigned at birth and gender identity, which is a metaphysic.
It's a metaphysic.
It's an anthropological view. So
yeah.
I guess you just answered the question. They just don't care.
They don't, or the reality is nobody's really a relativist, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the thing. And so on the one hand, it's not like if you're into queer theory, I mean, queer theory claims that both gender and sex are kind of social constructs, right? But that's not going to work for getting health insurance to cover stuff, right? And so they end up it's a type of essentialism where they say, well, no, what you really are is this gendered soul. But they don't want to be pressed generally into saying, well, yeah, a child can be born in the wrong body, because that sounds kind of crazy. And so what they'll say is, are you saying that trans kids don't exist? That's the problem. And so you've got to respond by saying, well, now what's a trans kid? What do you mean? Do you mean that a child has like dysphoria or something? Because what they want to do is have everyone sort of concede that children can be born in the wrong body, but not have to say that explicitly, because then it's okay, that's too crazy. So that's the implication of it. And so that's why I always lead by saying, it's like down to the question, can that person be born in the wrong body or not? And so what does that mean? And I just think it seems totally crazy once you sort of lay it out that way.
Yeah, and it is crazy, and it doesn't make sense, and it's incoherent. And so, but you also then have to say, well, how does it get seeped into not our entire public consciousness?
Yeah.
And this seems to be the area where the right has really absolute, lockstep. We all agree.
Yeah.
We might disagree about gay marriage. We might disagree about abortion, or which wave of feminism is the good one,
yes, exactly.
if any. But it seems to be this has been the defining line between who's really on the right side of things, not right side of history, but
in reality, or not.
Yeah.
Well, and this is actually what I think, that's why this is an unusual, it's strange to speak this way, but gender ideology is in some ways an opportunity, because same-sex marriage is a perfect example. The debate over same-sex marriage, I'm old enough to remember it, right? It was all social conservatives on one side and everybody else on the other. Gender ideology is not like that. So, of course, social conservatives don't like it, but evolutionary biologists generally don't like it either. Feminists who think women are real things don't like it. Gays and lesbians who think biological sex is a real thing don't like it. And so because just a kind of basic description of reality, and so as far as biological truths or public truths, when you're dealing with a really radical kind of anti-realist postmodernist view, which is what gender ideology is, basically everybody that's on team reality is together. So if you're a Christian that believes God created male and female, you're on board. If you're an atheist evolutionary biologist, right, that just thinks sex is a real thing, right, and the gametes are real things, you're going to be on team reality. And so that's why, in some ways, you could see this as the culmination on one thread of the sexual revolution, but it's also the culmination of a type of Marxism through cultural Marxism and conflict theory, and kind of radical postmodernism in its French and its sort of Frankfurt School form. And so it all comes down to this really, really radical thing. And so it ends up creating a very diverse set of allies. And that's why I think it's an opportunity, because we could create a coalition of the reality, a coalition of faith and reason, right? Because, Pope Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger, predicted this. He said it would end up being the church that would be the defenders of public reason after the public philosophy of the West had turned completely against reason. I think we're actually watching that happen right now.
Right. Because the activists, I don't know if you would, I guess, say that we should separate out the and the T as lobbies.
I would say
activist
certainly as lobbies.
groups.
Yeah, the way I would put it is, okay, there's a reason that the Human Rights Campaign moved in 2015 immediately from the LGB to the T. They pivoted immediately institutionally. Donors on the left all pivoted to that as well. And so they're obviously related in some way, and they're all sort of a manifestation of the sexual revolution. Right. So I don't want to pretend that these are totally different things. On the other hand, if you're an L or B or G, you presumably believe that the sexual binary is real, right? And so that's the sort of irony. And so I think we could say, look, in some ways these things are related, but in other ways, at a kind of fundamental level, this is a weird kind of pastiche of what people imagine is these are sort of a coalition of groups of people that all have the same interest. They really don't. They don't have the same interest. And so if you were, say, a gay man, a same-sex attracted man that wanted to make the case for same-sex marriage, and you said, this isn't going to mess up, sort of public marriage, and then all of a sudden you've got a crazy drag queen story hour, doing pornography in front of little kids, for both strategic reasons, like you don't want to be associated with that, but also you might just be genuinely appalled by it. And so I honestly think social conservatives like me, we need to accept that look, okay, maybe this is unusual. We'd be on other sides of an argument on this other issue, but we should consider each other allies. People, respect the fact that people see part of the truth and affirm that, even if you think they don't see the whole truth. That's what I think we're dealing with here.
It's a good, I think, ecumenical approach to dealing with a very important problem.
Ed Fulner, longtime president of the Heritage Foundation, would often say, this is like apocryphal at Heritage, I haven't found this written, but is that Ed always said, your 80% friend doesn't need to be your 20% enemy. People on the right, unfortunately, we do this thing, I think Freud called the narcissism of small differences, right? So we agree with 95%, but we have a slightly different take on John Locke or something, right? Or the reading of this. And so that's what we spend our time fighting about. The left doesn't do that. The left is like the locust in the book of Joel, which Joel talks about the locusts sort of marching in perfect uniformity, and they all work together. So you can get labor unionists and radical environmentalists. Somehow they're allies on the left, right? On the right, you get 12 different kinds of conservative, and we all sort of fight amongst ourselves. We've got to figure out how to actually work together while having some major disagreements on things.
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to the image of the locusts then, this is very widespread amongst normal people. Yeah. Which is very strange because I think most people just operate on a basic understanding of common sense. Sure. And this is not commonsensical.
Not at all.
What are I'm sure at Heritage you're looking at not only the underlying intellectual, philosophical underpinnings of how all of this comes to bear, but then also the actual work of basic progressive transgender activist agents who are seeking to foist this upon the entire public square. How have they been successful in the way that they have? What are the things that you're seeing that they're doing?
Well, they succeeded in part because they did this behind the scenes for years, right? And so, there are probably a dozen or more widely disseminated kindergarten books that are in schools designed to teach kids gender ideology. Like it feels good to be me is one example of this. But if you know of a kindergarten book, to get that adopted in public schools, that was a major campaign where you'd have to, first of all, get the book published, right? Create fake award ceremonies to give it awards so that it would get adopted by school districts and then get put in libraries and then have teachers use it, right? That's a 5 or 10-year campaign. And so from the outside, it looks like this all just happened at once. It's like all of a sudden you read Irreversible Damage by Abigail Shrier, you see Chloe Cole, you think, wait, what happened? Well, we just suddenly became aware of it, but they were actually very slow in working this, especially into educational institutions, so that it dug in really, really well. In some ways, it was the serendipity, the perverse serendipity of the COVID lockdowns that kind of exposed what was happening. Right. And so all of a sudden, parents are seeing crazy teachers on Zoom doing this gender catechesis to their kids, and it woke them up, and so I think that's part of it, is that all of a sudden now people are sort of shocked by it. The problem is that shock by itself is not useful because people need to channel shock and outrage into socially sort of productive activities. And so that's why, like in 2023, the activity has been specifically around bills that deal with what's happening in schools, like secret social transition behind parents' backs. Right? That's a part of it. And then also this gender affirming medicine for minors. Something like 20 states have passed laws in 2023 restricting the application of this treatment to kids, right? And of course, this is going to work its way out through the courts. But in some ways, that the transition medicine for children is visceral to people. And so even people that don't have the patience to think about gender ideology, look, we're sterilizing kids. That's bad. You just don't need to have a whole lot of lights on in your head to realize, okay, I don't know a lot, but sterilizing kids seems like a bad thing. And so that's why it's really important to fight the gender medicine stuff for kids, because it's a massive coalition of people that agree with that. But it's one symptom of this larger problem.
Right.
And so I'd say we've got to defeat it there. It ultimately gets defeated by class action lawsuits. I mean, detransitioners are going to sue these clinics into oblivion. I just, as policymakers, we want to try to slow things down so at least the pool of victims is not all that large.
Right.
But we still have to fight the ideology that's in our institutions.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're teaching kids, a 12-year-old kid who is struggling with puberty, that he or she's born in the wrong body, that's toxic even if they're not going to go get cross-sex hormones. And so, but I would say the battle over the ideology, that's a kind of 25-year thing. I think the fight over the medicine is more like a 5-year
That could be a
fight.
flashpoint.
That's what I think, yeah.
On the subject of, I guess, how conservatives are fighting back against the medical transitioning, I think a lot of it is, and in schools as well with curricula, a lot of it backs into like parental rights.
Absolutely.
Very important.
Yes.
But I think at least that it doesn't give us any grounds to.
Right.
Well, if parental rights are parental rights, that's a trump against a policymaker who would seek to restrict
both directions.
Yeah, it works in both ways.
That's right.
So is that, I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So parents' rights by themselves are stopgap. So in a situation where secret social transitioning is happening, a parents' rights bill can be very useful.
Right.
Of course, the other side's smart. So the ACLU, in fighting these medicine bills around the country, they're arguing in terms of parents' rights. They're saying these bills prevent parents from being able to get their children the health care that they need or that they want, right? So they're framing it in terms of parents' rights. And so what's going on here? Well, ultimately, there's a battle between what is good medicine and what are the limits of parents' rights. Nobody thinks the parents' rights extend to absolutely everything. Parents don't have the right to kill their children, right? Or to sterilize them. And at the same, so the question is going to be, well, is this good medicine or not? Or is this quackery, right? And so we can't just be sort of talking about education. We need to be, there has to be a fight actually on the evidence itself. And so that's why there are other people working in this space. I'm more of a generalist, but people that are actually focusing on the science that are also fighting that. I'm absolutely convinced that the evidence against this is going to be overwhelming. But at the moment, that's tough because you end up having to be, the dissidents are the ones that actually have to talk about this. It's very similar to what we were dealing with the lockdowns, right? The smart guys said, lockdowns are a bad idea. They might have been at Harvard or Oxford or Stanford Medical School, but they were speaking against the powers that be at the NIH, and so they were considered heretics.
Right.
That's what's happening right now. It's the brave heretics that are smart enough to be able to sort of expose the bad ideas. But I actually think reality ultimately trumps over bad ideologies. I mean, bad ideologies might stay in power in the Soviet Union for 70 or 100 years or whatever, but reality ultimately trumps bad ideas. So that's what I think is going to happen here.
The Soviet Union did fall.
No, it fell. It fell.
Point.
There's a lot, huge cost, huge human cost, but it ultimately wasn't in keeping with reality.
You're right. Let me ask then about adults. We've been talking about kids in particular, and that's sort of the politically relevant flashpoint.
Right.
But this is happening with adults as well. Yeah. How much Michael Knowles got in trouble with his CPAC speech? Transgenderism, not transgender people, but transgenderism. The ideology and all of the concomitant practices needs to be eradicated from public life.
I totally agree. The ideology needs to be eradicated. Now, to eradicate an ideology is not to lock people up, right? In other words, it's to take an ideology and make sure that it has such disrepute that no one is really willing to defend it publicly. That's what eugenics is, right? Eugenics, look, Buck v. Bell in the 1920s, 8-1 said in the Supreme Court of the United States, said laws forcibly sterilizing people in states were constitutional. The one judge, the devout Catholic that was the dissenter, didn't even bother to write a dissent because he knew no one would read it. So that's how totally pervasive this kind of elite idea was. And you know what happened? Well, in this case, what happened is the Nazis adopted eugenics and destroyed the brand, weirdly. And so no one wanted to be associated with it, right?
Yeah.
Now, we didn't kill everyone that advocated eugenics, right? But we eradicated the idea, at least officially. That's what I think has to happen to gender ideology. It has to be seen as, okay, this inspired complete insanity. It preyed on kids with serious psychological comorbidities. It preyed on awkward girls on the autism spectrum, vulnerable people that should be protected. It's a horrible idea. It should not be taught in schools. We should not be teaching kids that they could be born in the wrong body. That's absolutely right. Now the question is, okay, what about adults versus kids, right? Yeah. Okay, so on the one hand, I don't think it makes sense that to claim that people could be born in the wrong body. It's not like after you're 18, you might be born in the wrong body, right? That just doesn't follow. On the other hand, I don't think that it is as existential for adults as it is for kids, because in some ways, I think it's wrong, for instance, that a plastic surgeon would take a man that wants to look like a lizard and chop body parts off, right? But you see this guy on the internet, right? They split tongue and everything. Yeah. I don't think it really makes sense that we would make that a felony because it's just a bad thing. I think what should happen is that medical organizations should tell doctors, we're not going to do that, right? That's what I think should happen in this case. Adults do things, bad things, and we might let them do it, not because they have the right to do it or because it's a good thing. It's just because, okay, we let adults do some crazy things to themselves that are bad. What I don't think conservatives should say is, it's fine for adults to do it, but we just want to wait until they're 18 to make that decision.
Right.
That implies that it's actually, once you're 18, if you were born in the wrong body, then you'll know it. I mean, that's like conceding things that I don't think we need to concede.
Yeah,
so I could
that's
say,
a great clarification.
Yeah, it's like, no, it's still insane, and maybe maybe it's not a felony if a doctor will do, an adult can find a doctor to do this. But we shouldn't be implying that the kind of assumptions of gender ideology might apply for adults, but that kids are just too young to be able to make that decision.
Yeah.
I hear a lot of Republican politicians speaking that way, like we just really kids should have to wait until they're 18 to make this decision, as if we're talking about, I don't know, joining the military or something. That doesn't make any sense. It's what's crucial here, though, is that children can't, I don't think, give informed consent to something like their own sterilization. Yeah. And so they just can't give consent for that. I think an adult could give consent, and so it's like morally less significant.
Yeah.
But I still don't think adults can be born in the wrong body either.
No.
I mean, and I think that it's medicalizing a psychological pathology, and that's a bad thing. But what happened is that because Americans have a kind of libertarian spirit, it's like, okay, Bruce Jenner, Caitlyn Jenner, okay, whatever, right? In some ways, we're going to have to kind of rethink some of the things that we did. So states, for instance, that have allowed adults who wanted to transition and present as the opposite sex to change their sex on their birth certificate, that was a mistake. We shouldn't be falsifying birth certificates. But we did it because people just thought, oh, it's a few eccentric people, it's fine. They didn't realize that was going to become the kind of camel's nose under the tent for the whole program. And that's unfortunately what it's become.
And then you also have the issue of Bostock, and
what
do you do with that? Now that's setting precedent, and it's probably not going anywhere, and it's being expanded.
Yeah, and Bostock, it was narrowly construed to focus just on employment.
Yeah.
But of course, the Biden administration is trying to expand it in every possible way.
And it's hard not to once you accept the logic.
Absolutely. It doesn't, I don't think it's, Gorsuch is a very smart guy. I just think it's not a stable decision because he presupposes biological sex in order to come to it. So he says, well, sex discrimination is wrong, but if somebody's looks like a woman and is a male and you're not letting them present, then you're discriminating against them based upon their sex. So it's just only something that an intellectual could come up with, but it presupposes biological sex. So I really don't think it's ultimately really a stable decision. I think it's just like, okay, the court's going to have to, I'm hoping that once Gorsuch himself realizes, I hadn't quite anticipated where this was going to go, that maybe they will decide it in a different way.
Yeah. Let me ask a couple of questions in closing.
Sure.
Moving towards things that we can do, putting these things into action. You, as the head of part of Heritage, a think tank, what are the things that you and Heritage are doing? And to push back against the ideology, the practices. Yeah,
and so Heritage is a public policy think tank, so we can't do everything. And I'm the first person. I always will say, public policy can't fix everything, but we want to do is come up with policies that are actually helpful. And so, for instance, I didn't think that necessarily leading with bills that prohibited these medical procedures was even the best approach. I actually thought that Florida had the best approach. Florida started with the Parental Rights and Education bill, so focus on that secret social transition. Then they had their Board of Medicine and Osteopathic Medicine and the Board of Health do their own studies, issue their own reports, right? So the relevant health authorities in the states weighed in, and then the legislature passed a bill that prohibits these procedures. I actually think kind of ideally that was the right order, but of course states are all different. And so once many states decided, okay, look, we want to restrict these procedures in places that had strong Republican majorities, we encourage states just to make the laws good, because a law can be well-intentioned and still be unconstitutional. And so I'm happy to report that the bills that generally pass, there's some variations, but I think they are constitutionally sound. There's no reason that they shouldn't stand up in court. The reality, though, is that judges in federal courts are creatures of our culture, and so they don't have time to study these issues. And so if they're dealing with a conflict that looks like it's a conflict between the American Medical Association on one side and the Republican legislature on the other, a lot of judges are just going to say, I don't know, I'm just going to go with these medical groups.
Right.
And so that's why it's going to be kind of a long, hard slog, because the reality is the medical groups are ideologically captured and just shouldn't be trusted on this. That's the truth of the matter. But I wouldn't expect federal judges always to know that. And so I would expect that some of these bills will get struck down, some will get passed through. That's what's happening right now. And so Kentucky, I think, and Tennessee, those are still in play. A couple of these may end up all the way at the Supreme Court. I don't know how that's probably not going to happen. But all of these are kind of temporary measures, I think, because I do ultimately think whatever happens with these bills, this stuff dies because these gender clinics are creating their own opposition with the patients who are victimized by these procedures, and that's the detransitioners. And they are absolutely going to sue these clinics to oblivion, and they richly deserve it.
So that's, I guess, what the policymakers are doing,
Yes.
what you're doing, what Heritage, Republicans, legislatures across the country, judges. What about, the proverbial man on the street? This is the absolute fusion of personal and political.
It is.
And so what do all of us have to do in daily life to push back against?
I would say that everybody needs to do a little reading on this. I mean, honestly, my predecessor, Ryan Anderson, wrote the kind of, I think still the definitive policy book on this. Was When Harry Became Sally. It's a terrific book. It's aged very well. It's been out about 5 years. You can't get it on Amazon, which proves how good it is. So I just always tell people, look, if you just start there. But there have been probably a dozen books written in the last 2 years, many of them by kind of left-wing feminists in the UK, that are really, really good books. A couple of books by Carl Trueman, an American theologian, really, really good. A couple of new books by Nancy Pearcey, an evangelical theologian and philosopher. And so just do some reading so you kind of know what you're dealing with, because especially if you're a parent, you need to inoculate your kids against this. You can't quarantine your kids against these things. So you can homeschool them, you can keep them from getting the gender support plans in the public schools or whatever, but what you need to do is, if you have kids, is you need to think, okay, in terms of inoculation, controlled exposure to these ideas so that they build up intellectually resistant antibodies to this stuff so that they're immune to it, right? The last thing you want is to try to protect them from it and then all of a sudden they get exposed. This stuff's crazy, and most kids that are even moderately capable can figure that out, but they're going to need their parents to actually help them through it.
All right. Well, that's all I have for questions. Thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Yeah.
If people want to stay up to date on follow what you're doing in all of this, where should they look?
Absolutely. So the real time would be Twitter or X, whatever it's called now, right? It's at Dr. J. Richards, and then my stuff and stuff of colleagues is available at the Heritage website, heritage.org.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Dr. Richards, and thank you to our listeners for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review. We'll see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.